Hello.
Our story begins on the moon of Concordia. Master Qui-Gon Jinn had contacted his young apprentice, Obi Wan Kenobi, for the first time in months. He informed the Jedi Padawan that it was over. They could come back to Sundari. The bounty hunters and Mandalorians that had been tracking them for the last year of their lives were dealt with. It was time for him to return the Duchess to her palace, so that she may lead her people. Obi-Wan was both happy and sad. He and Satine had grown especially close in the past year since being on the run. Due to the circumstances, they were forced to trust each other, but the trust they were forced to share developed more naturally over the course of the last 12 months. It was more than survival. While the Jedi didn't have a word for it, the people of the galaxy would call it love. There was so much triumph in the fact that she could go home. As a young duchess of her people, she would be forced to return to a system in carnage. They weren't more than a decade removed from a civil war that cut their population in half. The people of Mandalore had Satine's advisors to thank for running the system in her absence, but she could finally do what she was born to do. Though with the triumph of victory, there was a tragedy of losing someone she deeply cared about. The two of them knew they loved each other, but they didn't know if the feelings were mutually shared. They each had their reasons for not sharing the truth. Obi-Wan was a Jedi. It was forbidden, and Satine knew how much he cared about the Jedi Order. Satine was a Duchess. While it wasn't forbidden, she was a leader of a world devastated by war. Distractions were the last thing the 18-year-old Duchess needed. Perhaps it would be best if they just let their last year remain just that, something that only existed in the past, with no bearing on the future. Neither one of them wanted that to be the case, but Satine especially wasn't going to force Obi-Wan to choose between her and the Jedi Order. If she truly loved him, which she did, then she wouldn't make him choose between two things he loved. Obi-Wan was thinking about these same things, but he wouldn't ever leave the Jedi Order unless she said the word. It was a weird little dynamic, but they both weren't willing to make the other sacrifice something they cared about. They had maybe an hour at most alone. There was a Cormac-class starfighter coming to pick them up. The two of them sat down in an open field, by some rocks. It gave them a place to sit, but also visibility for the royal pilots to find them. As they sat there, they couldn't find conversation. Despite both being only 18, they always had something to talk about. Aspirations, stories, jokes, but right now, there was nothing. They couldn't even look at each other. It was too emotional. Being that they were so young, it felt like the end of the world, like they would never see each other again. And while they were young and had a great concept of the galaxy around them, simply due to their positions in life, it didn't change how fleeting the moment felt. Each of them had the words creeping towards the tips of their tongues, but it was silent, remorseful almost. Despite how stressful and sometimes even terrifying their time together had been, they didn't want it to end, because it was just them, only reliant on each other for survival, and that was something tragically beautiful. The feelings shared between them could ignite a star, it could create vision for the blind, it could heal broken hearts, and yet it was silent. Every few moments one would look at the other and take in their individual beauty, before turning their eyes before the other caught them. How devastating it would be to let these feelings wither away as they departed back to their own lives. Satine spoke up first, asking if this was the way they should leave it. Obi-Wan looked over to her and told her that he never wanted to leave it. There was nothing in the galaxy that could ever make leaving it feel right. Satine turned to him and expressed that she felt similarly about it. For the longest time, it felt like they had forever, and now it seemed like forever wasn't long enough for them. He asked her if they could really have forever. She didn't break eye contact. Satine then spoke up, calling him Ben and telling him that they could if they tried. Perhaps it wouldn't be easy, but if these feelings were real, then why let them slip? He agreed. There was not a doubt in his mind that he was willing to commit, but she stopped his train of thought, telling him that she didn't want him to give up the Order. She knew how much being a Jedi meant to him, and he at that moment knew it was true love. Not that in his mind being a Jedi outweighed his love for her, but the consideration, the ability to compromise despite it possibly hurting her, which it didn't. They moved closer, grabbing each other's hands, and as if their minds were connected as one, they both proposed a secretive marriage. As if it weren't written in the stars, they proposed to each other with one conversation, one that would bind them together forever. Satine knew that they wouldn't have time when they got back to Sundari, but they would need a witness too. Obi-Wan smiled and told her that he could make some time. He could distract Qui-Gon with something. They planned everything out and waited for their pickup. When the time came for their secret marriage, Obi-Wan would distract Qui-Gon with some mission updates from a log. It was a poor distraction because Qui-Gon had been reading these updates for the last several months. Obi-Wan just had no clue, so he skimmed over them again and realized he already read everything in them. When he finished, he realized his student was gone, and started looking for him. Master Jin would come across a student and the Duchess on a balcony with a Mandalorian official, one that was very close to Satine's father, someone she trusted with her life, and someone who wouldn't tell anyone of this binding. Qui-Gon watched with a smile on his face as the student and the Duchess bound themselves to one another for life. His smile radiated from the window before he looked down and back over to them, before walking back to the ship and grabbing the log Obi-Wan so desperately wanted him to read. Kenobi and Kryze were one, a relationship recognized by both newlyweds. Obi-Wan and Satine only had a few more minutes to themselves on the balcony, where they would simply hold each other, not wanting to let go. But the time had to come, no matter how much they didn't want for it to come. It did eventually come, and they said their formal goodbyes. Obi-Wan followed his master into their shuttle, and they departed from the system. Qui-Gon never said a word about what he saw. To him, it wasn't a big deal, and he was supportive of Obi-Wan breaking the status quo. Finally, his student could be like him and Dooku, though they still need to work at a time when Obi-Wan and Dooku could meet each other. While the secret marriage to Satine wouldn't change Obi-Wan's fundamental values as a Jedi, he did start to see flaws with the Jedi Code, and appreciate Qui-Gon's own interpretation of the code itself. Especially how Qui-Gon regarded the path of the Jedi. He chose the Jedi because they were the light. There were a lot of fallacies, and once Obi-Wan opened himself to them, he couldn't unsee their failures as a collective order. This allowed his relationship with Qui-Gon to become more balanced. There were less conflicts and less arguments about Qui-Gon's distrust of the Jedi Council. Initially, Obi-Wan feared that his master could get in trouble with the Council. After the Mandalore mission, he believed that Qui-Gon was right to go against the Council, especially in a manner to do what was best. The change Qui-Gon saw was exactly why he wanted to give Obi-Wan the reins and allow him to enjoy the relationship without his presence or influence. Kenobi changed almost overnight because he was allowed to express his emotions more openly. Qui-Gon was always open with Obi-Wan, but once Kenobi introduced Satine to his weekly life, he became a lot more attached to what made him human. Due to the distance, time zones, and busy schedules of both Duchess of Mandalore and Jedi Padawan, they had a hard time keeping in contact with each other. But they made sure there was always an open slot for them during the week. If they were lucky, they got the chance to talk 1 to 3 times a week. Unlucky weeks were when they never spoke to each other, simply due to misaligning schedules. This did hurt both of them emotionally, but they both trusted each other. There were no feelings or fears of insincerity. It was a strong and firm bond, but Qui-Gon could tell that the distance was harming his student. So Master Jin made sure he could visit Mandalore with his student for a quote-unquote follow-up mission. Jedi didn't do this, but Qui-Gon did. This continued to strengthen the bond between master and apprentice. Qui-Gon made sure the two of them got a week together. He went to Mandalore to investigate potential threats that could have stayed hidden after their departure, which meant Obi-Wan was guarding the Duchess in her palace and Qui-Gon was looking for nothing. He still looked, but he wasn't really under the belief that he would find anything. This week was everything the two of them needed. They could catch up and spend time together, spending pretty much every second of every day together until it was time for them to depart. They left with an open hug in front of everyone, which no one really batted an eye to. Not that they thought there was a relationship, aside from the advisor and Qui-Gon, but the fact that they were just close friends. The next several years of their lives would be very similar. It was difficult, but the two of them always found new ways to express their care for each other. Sometimes it would be flowers delivered to the Palace of Sundari or the Jedi Temple, addressed to each other with secret admirers and so forth. Ways to make sure the relationship was both in open but secret. Because truthfully, as long as Obi-Wan quote-unquote didn't know who this secret admirer was, then who cares? Obi-Wan really emulated Qui-Gon as he grew into a man, and even due to this, became a Jedi Knight early. Qui-Gon was worried that Obi-Wan's tightness with the code would hold him back, so when he learned to let go of that attachment, ironically, Qui-Gon believed he was ready for his trials. Despite Kenobi becoming a Jedi Knight at 23, their lives would be relatively similar. Obi-Wan had the freedom to return to Mandalore from time to time, which was nice for him, but nothing substantial would be different for him. Qui-Gon would ask Obi-Wan to join him when he was sent to the blockade of Naboo. Qui-Gon would have asked Dooku, but he wasn't inside the temple when it happened. Sadly, Dooku was talking with Sidious when Qui-Gon began the mission. It would be a costly mistake that Dooku did not accompany his student. Qui-Gon, despite Obi-Wan being a Jedi Knight, would fall victim to the Sith assassin on Naboo. It would be Obi-Wan who finished the job, and it would be Kenobi who promised to take care of the training for Skywalker. The loss of his master was devastating, and it would be very challenging for the young Jedi to overcome. But as was his promise to Qui-Gon, he would immediately oversee the training of Anakin Skywalker. Due to his closeness with Satine, he was able to inform her about Qui-Gon's death. she was equally as devastated. But as Obi-Wan was there for her when her father's close friend died, she'd be there for Obi-Wan. Both of them lost mentors at an early age, and it would be through solidarity with each other that they'd find strength. Though as things had been for the last several years, they would have to return to their weekly calls in absence from each other's lives. The Jedi Council had no worries when it came to Obi-Wan training Anakin. The reason for this is because Obi-Wan never showed signs of being anything like Qui-Gon. This was for a number of reasons, but it was mostly because Qui-Gon took up most of the brunt of everything. Obi-Wan always agreed with his master, especially after their first mission to Mandalore, but Obi-Wan was still regarded as the struggling student from his younger days, the Jedi who persevered and was beyond loyal to the Code. This was also in part to how Kenobi carried himself. He wasn't nearly as radical as Dooku, but he sat between Qui-Gon and Dooku in their spectrum of disagreements with the Council and the Code. But Obi-Wan was negotiable. He saw the fallacies but realized how simple it was to fix them. He just never spoke up, because as a Padawan and even a knight, it wasn't his place to. Anakin initially had struggles with Jedi instruction. He wasn't exactly welcomed and he felt insecure initially. Obi-Wan didn't really notice this, partially because Anakin hid his feelings from his instructor, mostly to him trusting Qui-Gon more than Obi-Wan. The other reason Kenobi didn't notice is because he didn't think this would happen. He got picked on when he was little, but that's because he was the worst in his class. Obi-Wan persevered and figured that the kid who won a literal pod race would too, if it ever happened. Though after a couple months worth of Jedi training and growing out his new beard and hair, Obi-Wan caught wind of the changes. He saw Anakin getting picked on and stepped in. He called out the bullies for their erratic behavior and informed their instructor so that fair punishments could be given to them. This is why the Council never assumed Obi-Wan changed. His actions were in line with the Code. His rhetoric reflected that of a Council master. Kenobi, after the incident, would formally request to pull a student from basic training. The Council wanted to know why, and Obi-Wan informed them that it wasn't a suitable learning environment for Anakin. The negative connotation his student might have with his peers could stint his growth as a Jedi. Kenobi wanted to get his student away from the temple for a little while, and the Council wanted to know where. Obi-Wan suggested Concordia or Mandalore. He had his own most growth during his early years as a student on those planets. Plus, it might help Anakin get more accustomed to an advanced society. The Council looked to each other and Master Windu sanctioned it, believing that it'd be a good way to bring the boy into their way of life. It was jarring going from Tatooine to Coruscant. Being inside of Sundari would allow Skywalker time to grapple with the differences in societal tone, as well as how to handle not being around crime lords, slavers, and pirates. They could also work individually on his Force skills, so it'd be good for Anakin to catch up on his basic classes before moving to the next stages of his training. Who knows, maybe Anakin could get advanced placement when he came back. The Council responded well to Obi-Wan's tone and negotiation, allowing the two Jedi to go to Mandalore. Anakin was a little beaten down by everything that led up to this moment, but his master's attitude changed that for him. Anakin was a little more excitable because Obi-Wan was giddy with excitement and joy. The two of them were able to continue building their bond with each other as they traveled to Mandalore. Obi-Wan never told the full story, but he did give Anakin insight into what Satine was like and the fact that they were friends. Skywalker was now excited. His expectations were not misplaced when they arrived. The Duchess walked out with her escort and greeted her good friend, Ben Kenobi. She also greeted the young Anakin Skywalker, someone she was very delighted to meet and see. Despite the beauty of Coruscant, Sundari was enchanting. It was the capital of a once war-torn society, one that was once almost reduced to ash. Seeing it in all of its glory was inspiring. Due to Anakin connecting to the Force, he could almost feel the weight of the history here. While Sundari didn't see the worst of the war, the pain left behind was felt. Satine had done a lot of work in the past 7 years as Duchess of Mandalore. There'd be a state dinner for the two Jedi guests, and once Anakin went to sleep inside the royal palace, Obi-Wan and Satine were able to spend time together, which was much needed for the two of them. While Obi-Wan did want to spend all of his time with Satine, she was still Duchess, and she was very busy. He was also very busy himself, and he didn't want to let on to the secret relationship he had with her. Anakin was oblivious to it, as most kids are when adults say things with subtle hints or double entendres. The training for Anakin would be very beneficial. Obi-Wan learned a lot from Qui-Gon, and he took the best of Master Jin's instructions and that of the Jedi Order. Obi-Wan still hurt because of Qui-Gon's death, but he was able to handle the tragedy of his master's death by teaching Qui-Gon's best lessons to Anakin. It made everything come full circle for the new Jedi Master. They spent about a month on Mandalore before leaving, which had Anakin feeling a bit sad about the departure. But there was something very important to their presence. Anakin was able to confide in Satine when Obi-Wan was sleeping or doing any number of things. What Satine learned was the horrid nature of the Outer Rim, things that Obi-Wan never saw because he never went into Mos Espa. The revelation disgusted Satine, and she promised Anakin that by the time they visited Mandalore next, his mother would be freed. This warmed Anakin's heart as he left his older politician friend. Satine was someone that Anakin felt he could look up to. Her story inspired him in many ways, and she expressed proudness for his accomplishments. Anakin would ask Obi-Wan about going back to Mandalore a number of times during their trip through hyperspace, which he was very pleased with, promising that one day they could go back and be with the Duchess. When Anakin returned to the temple, he was put into the advanced classes, just as his master suggested. Their training in solitude on Mandalore provided an adequate training ground for the young Jedi. He was able to experience the Force openly and connect to it through a teacher solely focused on him. Anakin's development continued as he started to develop friendships with his peers, which strengthened his belief in the Jedi teachings. Obi-Wan would also keep him updated on everything regarding movement of slaves in the Outer Rim and any news regarding his mother. It was very challenging for Satine. She rebuilt her society from the ground up, and she formed connections with numerous systems and worlds around the galaxy. Prior to her leadership, the galaxy traded with Mandalore, but only very skittishly. They weren't known for being reliable, and following the Civil War, they lost all their trade partners. Mandalore was sitting on an island alone, with no one to help them. Satine was able to restructure old alliances and build off her father's success as a leader, and then heighten Mandalore's success with her own twist. It's part of the reason why she delved so deeply into pacifism. It saved her people from starvation and a total depression, which would have curb-stomped their society following the Civil War. Satine was able to rally support, credits, and supplies to push for a relief effort into the Outer Rim. Without backing from the Republic, due to stinginess from Palpatine, Satine was forced to work alone on this. She almost got Dooku to bite, but he was playing Palpatine's game. It was really sad too. This was the type of thing that Dooku left the Jedi Order behind for. But because of Palpatine, he couldn't ally himself with someone like Satine. This movement was referred to as the Neutral Systems Coalition, though it wasn't meant to look like it was against the Republic. The Republic itself didn't really like it, but Satine didn't care. Her focus was on helping the people of the Outer Rim. The issue is, the crime syndicates weren't going to just hand over their slaves, and the Neutral Systems didn't want a war. As a way to avoid all-out war with the crime families, many slaves were bought with either credits or supplies that the Neutral Systems had in transition or extra of. Some people really didn't like this, but the message, especially from Satine, was to remember what Mandalore once was. They were nothing, on the brink of total economic collapse and starvation. Without allies, they wouldn't be prosperous. She just wished she knew about this earlier. While it was decent, she and her allies weren't satisfied when they freed 80% of slaves in the Outer Rim. They wished they could free more, but the crime families weren't budging. They didn't like that they lost their slaves. Sure, the credits were good, but slaves were cheap labor. Perhaps their obsession with credits and supplies sold them out, which was true. Among the slaves bought and brought to Mandalore was Shmi Skywalker. It took a long time to get these people registered in the civilized galaxy, but once Satine learned she had Anakin's mother, she contacted Obi-Wan immediately. Within days, they were able to come back so mother and son could reunite. It was so special for Satine and Obi-Wan to see. Anakin viewed them almost like mother and father in the absence of Shmi, and now he had his real mom back. This didn't mean that neither Obi-Wan or Satine would lose their importance. It was just a matter of Shmi being his mom. Over the years, when Anakin was 16, they'd returned to Mandalore, though this time for trouble on Concordia. It turned out that there were potential rebels forming. This wasn't confirmed, but some Mandalorians didn't agree with Satine's approach to the slaves issue. One of these individuals made such a big fuss that it caught the attention of the Royal Guard. They weren't able to capture him, but they trailed him and broke off when he arrived at Governor Vizsla's home in Concordia. Young Skywalker and Master Kenobi were sent in to investigate. They didn't think it'd be much, and truthfully, they weren't far off. The Mandalorians on Concordia weren't a large movement. They called themselves Death Watch, and it was Obi-Wan and Anakin who discovered them. The two Jedi went undercover for 3 days, studying the movements of Pre-Vizsla, who had no clue they were there. This was completely covert, even though Satine didn't want to do it like that. None of her advisors knew about it. The only people who knew were Satine, Obi-Wan, Anakin, and Shmi, just because Anakin visited her. Obi-Wan led Anakin in, who followed his master's command to a T. Due to their dynamic, there were no power struggles between the two of them. Anakin's ego did flare up, but it was quickly put to rest before getting too out of control. They moved through an abandoned mining shaft, keeping their distance from the two guards who were in there. Anakin looked to Obi-Wan. As they made eye contact, they simply gave out directions. Quickly, Anakin took the high ground and jumped up, as Obi-Wan snuck up behind one of the guards and wrapped his arm around his neck. Anakin dropped down, doing the same, until both guards were unconscious. Skywalker and Kenobi moved to an elevator shaft that took them up to an overlook after they hid the bodies. When they got up there, they found the camp of rebel Mandalorians. Anakin looked at Obi-Wan and asked if they should call for reinforcements. Kenobi smiled with a grin, asking Anakin if he thought they needed them. Skywalker pulled his lightsaber without igniting it and nodded his head. Kenobi did the same. The Jedi moved from their perch down the side of the rock formation that this camp was built under. They kept their eyes peeled for any signs of Pre Vizsla. Obi-Wan was under the impression that Pre had bad intentions for Mandalore. Anakin spotted Pre walk out of what appeared to be the main tent. There were probably 30 or 40 Mandalorians in this camp. Anakin wasn't sure if they were going to be killing or knocking out these traitors, but that question answered itself when a Mandalorian returned via jetpack and saw the two intruders sneaking around. He called out the Jedi, and they looked back. As the Mandalorian dropped the rocket, Obi-Wan shoved Anakin back and used the Force to propel the rocket back into the Mandalorian trooper, who exploded. Kenobi looked over with a little smile as he waved at the Mandalorians looking at him. He ignited his lightsaber, as did Skywalker. This might prove to be troublesome. They ran down into the camp to avoid taking fire from every direction. Kenobi and Skywalker slid down and cut the first 3 Mandalorians down. It wasn't with ease, but they did it. Their blades moved quickly to defend blaster bolts back at their targets. Due to the Beskar, the Mandos were hard to knock out, but not all of them were wearing Mandalorian armor, due to it being dusk. Anakin and Obi-Wan split up, bouncing through tents and taking down more Mandalorians as they did. It wasn't easy, but they were able to make work of their opponent's unpreparedness. Skywalker pulled the same trick Obi-Wan did by throwing a rocket back into the laps of a half-dozen Mandalorians, before Pre Vizsla attacked Kenobi with the darksaber. Anakin could hear the clashing of lightsabers, never having seen the darksaber before. He came around the corner to see 14 Mandalorians gathered up. Others were chasing after Skywalker or running away, seeing how this was a lost cause. Obi-Wan defended himself from Pre, blocking all of his strikes and avoiding him when he used his jetpack to gain an advantage. Kenobi could see how this was playing out. Pre wouldn't take a straight fight, so Kenobi evened the odds by using the Force to drag him out of the sky and launch him into his friends, sending his jetpack off into a collection of other Mandalorians, unlucky enough to meet the fires of this explosion. Skywalker slammed his blade into Beskar, not making a dent, before being backhanded in the face. He used the Force to throw someone into a wall, before someone jumped on his back, and he used their arm to drag them off, throwing them to the ground, before decapitating another. Skywalker prepared the jab down, then he was kicked in the shin and his leg bent awkwardly, before the Mandalorian under him kicked him in the abdomen. Obi-Wan was back to fighting with Pre. He could see Anakin from the corner of his eye as he spun around Vizsla and kicked him in the back. He watched Anakin kick the helmet off a Mandalorian who was fighting, revealing the face of Bo-Katan. He knew Satine would never forgive him if Bo was killed. Obi-Wan yelled out the word "don't" as Anakin tried to kill her. He looked over as she whacked him in the head. Obi-Wan used the Force to shove Pre to the ground, calling out and telling Anakin that was Satine's sister. Anakin looked at Bo, who didn't really care for the sentiment, as she threw a fist into his chest. Anakin pulled a beam off the tent and dragged it under her legs and swept him out from under her, as he pulled his blade around with the Force and held it, cutting down a few other Mandalorians coming to fight him. Obi-Wan slid back before driving his blade into Pre's shin, and avoiding his hit, before sweeping his blade through the open patch under his arm, killing Vizsla immediately. Due to Kenobi being a Jedi, these other Mandalorians weren't going to just accept him as their new ruler, especially if he was bringing the blade back to Satine. So the fight became a king of the hill for the darksaber. Anakin threw Bo through a tent with the Force as he ran to Obi-Wan's aid. The two of them were outnumbered, but they had 3 lightsabers and that counted for something. They avoided swings from these broken warriors. Their morale was crushed, especially because these were Jedi. They should have been easier to kill. They fought as hard as they could until Anakin and Obi-Wan cut every last one of them down. As they finished, Obi-Wan asked where Satine's sister was, and Anakin shrugged his shoulders, before Obi-Wan lifted his own arm and stopped her from slamming a branch into Anakin's head. She was very angry, but there was time for anger later. They had to return to Sundari. Anakin was told to look after Bo, and make sure she didn't break free, which he was fine with. She had hand restraints and she was getting ready to pounce like a Nexu. Anakin was slightly unnerved by it, but he patiently waited out their trip back to Sundari. Everything would be explained to Satine, and the royal guard would go to pick up the pieces and make sure everyone was properly buried. Obi-Wan handed the darksaber over to her, which they would keep in secret. No reason to reveal the weapon to the public. Not that they would chase after it, but there was no reason to make it available to anyone. It was a piece of history that represented a legacy of suffering for their people. As for Bo, the reunion between sisters wasn't pleasant. Bo was the younger sister, and she wasn't fond of Satine's rule. There were some things that Bo didn't understand about her sister's leadership, and this lack of understanding created a divide in their relationship, which was a true travesty. Satine didn't want Bo to be punished, but for the time being, she was going to be kept locked away. Obi-Wan extended their mission time, because they actually had an issue to maintain. The Council never really cared. Was it a little odd that Obi-Wan went to Mandalore so frequently? Yeah. But he was Obi-Wan, and his student was just like him. Kenobi proved the Council wrong, but that's because he taught Anakin how to articulate things in a way the Council would be pleased with. A little give, a little take. So the Council didn't really care what Kenobi did, because he was the best of them in their eyes. While Obi-Wan was preparing to join the Royal Guard on Concordia, Satine asked Anakin to join her. She knew breaking this rebellious streak out of Bo would be difficult. Perhaps it'd be good to have a friend closer to her age. One that technically shouldn't have any loyalties to Mandalore. It was kind of a setup, but Satine was hopeful Bo and Anakin could begin a friendship, one that would help Bo come back around. Their introduction was by beating up each other inside of the Death Watch camp. Their second introduction was still a little hostile, but more formal, and gave Anakin and Bo more equal ground to work with. Skywalker was a little on edge about this, especially after their trip here from Concordia, but he gave it a shot. The following month on Mandalore would be very similar. Kenobi would bounce between Sundari and Concordia to hunt down any more loyalists of Death Watch, or any of the other more violent tribes. It was revealed through their search that Pre Vizsla had a manifesto written, one that exposed him for who he really was. Meanwhile, Anakin was getting to know Bo through a neutral environment, one without anyone watching, and one where they weren't bashing each other's heads into things. It really helped them with their communication. Due to how everything transpired in Anakin's life, he had a healthy connection to relationships that were functional. Not that he was seeing stars in his eyes, but Bo-Katan was pretty in his opinion, and he was willing to see where that went. It was a slow burn for Anakin. Maybe he had a concussion, maybe he actually felt something. All that was known is that by the end of their month on Mandalore, Bo was much calmer, and she wasn't really ready to let go of Anakin. He, similar to his master nearly 2 decades before, wasn't ready to leave. When the Jedi departed from Mandalore, Anakin would ask Obi-Wan a number of questions. He still hadn't caught on to the fact that Obi-Wan and Satine were married, simply because he was so used to seeing them act the way they did. But as he asked questions about the emotions he was feeling, he started to put things together, like a 4D puzzle. Anakin started to question if this entire time Obi-Wan and Satine were together. Part of him felt like that would be kind of wrong of Kenobi, like he was bringing Anakin out to Mandalore solely to be with his partner, but that was never true, and Anakin knew that. It was because of his own relationship with Satine that he was put off by Palpatine lurking over his shoulder every other week. It was because of Mandalore that he was able to return to the temple and enter the advanced classes and even make friends. It was because of Satine that he got his mother back. And then Anakin came up with the courage to ask the question, were Obi-Wan and Satine together? Kenobi had always been open with Anakin. Didn't matter what it was. He was always transparent with the student. So when Anakin asked the question, he was kind of blindsided by it, but he responded honestly and with sincerity. He informed Anakin that they were secretly married, but he made sure Anakin knew that this secret marriage was not why he kept going back to Mandalore. Anakin didn't care even if it was the truth, because he wasn't even getting the short end of the stick. Every time he went to Mandalore, he grew more as an individual, but it was very nice to know that he wasn't a second thought for Obi-Wan. The revelation of this marriage helped their conversation become a lot less awkward, and it let Anakin loosen up more. He did have some genuine feelings of attraction towards Bo, but she was a bit older than him. There were some instances where he felt those feelings inside the Jedi Temple, but he wasn't sure what to do about them. Obi-Wan made it clear to Anakin that he should trust his gut, approach these emotions with delicacy. It wouldn't be easy in his position, because unlike Obi-Wan and Satine, Anakin wasn't forced to be away with someone for an entire year, but Obi-Wan said if Anakin felt like there was a spark, he'd make sure Anakin got more time on Mandalore, with or without him, just so he could follow his heart and see what came from it. Skywalker was grateful for this, but he did want Obi-Wan to come with him, so that he at the very least could spend time with Satine. The relationship between master and apprentice was always strong, but it hadn't ever been this strong. The next 3 years would involve Anakin getting closer with Bo, and the relationship between Obi-Wan and Satine continuing to evolve. Anakin became a Jedi Knight when he was 18, but he and Obi-Wan stayed very close. Then of course, as a try to divide the bond between Anakin and Bo, Palpatine assigned him to Padme, as Obi-Wan began his hunt to find the Camino system. Anakin's time with Padme would be nostalgic, but he had 3 full years of interacting with Bo and thinking about her when he wasn't on Mandalore, over when was the last time he thought about Padme? It seemed odd to be placed on this mission, and Anakin was continuing to get weirded out by Palpatine. Padme and Anakin didn't really have any flares or romance. They just followed the mission and acted as friends. Padme felt a slight flame, but it was extinguished when Anakin went on a tangent about Bo and their adventures on Mandalore. The beginning of the Clone Wars followed not long after, and on Mandalore, Bo tried to get her sister to join the Republic, but Satine didn't buckle. Palpatine and Dooku pressured her as well, and instead, she decided to go in the opposite direction, pulling her allies together and forming the Neutral Systems Coalition. The Jedi, on the other hand, went straight into combat and fought on behalf of the Republic, which for Anakin and Obi Wan was troublesome. They wouldn't have time to stop by for visits with their friends and family on Mandalore. It would just be a continual grudge match between the Separatists and the Republic. Early into the war, Anakin was requested to Palpatine's office. He didn't really care for it, but he did as the Chancellor asked. While they were in there, Palpatine started talking about how he believed Anakin to be the greatest of all the Jedi. Palpatine had changed his manipulation strategies over the years, but Anakin was never bluntly honest with him. So Palpatine was always trying to counter Anakin, he just never could. During this day, Anakin was especially stressed out, and he was about to have his call with Bo, and then he was requested to Palpatine's office, so it wasn't like the greatest time ever for Skywalker. He had a new apprentice, was trying to get a grip on that, and he was really looking forward to chatting with Bo. They weren't an actual thing yet, but they were really close, and for Anakin, talking to a non-Jedi friend was very important to him. So taking that away from him, so Palpatine could gloat about Anakin, was really irritating. His relationship with Satine was a very big reason why everything with Palpatine never worked for him. It just wasn't the same. Palpatine felt like a politician, Satine felt like a human, and she felt maternal and caring. During this talk, Anakin accidentally tapped a vase by brushing against it. He caught it and felt its dark aura. He could tell that something wasn't right with it, and after his talk with Palpatine, including missing his call with Bo, he went directly to Mace Windu. The two of them had a much more trusting relationship with each other, mostly because Mace could actually trust Anakin. Skywalker told him of his suspicions, and Mace promised to look into it. The following week, the Jedi would confirm the worst. But instead of acting on it, they wouldn't. Not because they feared taking out Palpatine, but because this meant that Palpatine and Dooku were working together. The Separatists could very easily overwhelm the Republic if they took out Palpatine, so they needed something to work here. Well, new Council member Obi Wan Kenobi had an idea. He told them that Dooku and the Separatist leaders had been trying to get Mandalore to join their cause. If they tried really hard, they might be able to sneak onto Mandalore and blindside these leaders. But the issue was General Grievous. He was a loose cannon, and even if the Seppies pulled out of the war, he might not. The Jedi liked the setup. Getting Dooku and the Separatist Council to a meeting room would be challenging, but Satine could do it. Only issue was her protection. The following 4 months would have the Jedi preparing for not just the capture and/or death of Dooku and the Separatist Council, but the destruction of General Grievous, not to mention the quote-unquote disappearance of Palpatine. It was all set in stone. Kenobi, Skywalker, Windu, and Shakti would go to Mandalore. With them would be a group of elite clones. General Grievous was being lured into a fleet battle. He'd been popping Republic medical stations, and he intentionally received a distress signal from one of them. Palpatine was none the wiser. Over the past few months, the Jedi Council ran smearing campaigns against Palpatine, secretly. These kept him from getting support to get emergency powers within the Senate, so this meant Palpatine didn't have extra power to gloat with. On Mandalore, Dooku and the Separatist Council, after weeks of deciding on a plan of approach, arrived. They moved through Sundari and greeted the Duchess and her advisors. They began the discussions. The Viceroy of the Trade Federation tried negotiating some way to bring the Neutral Systems Coalition into the Separatist Alliance. Satine was adamant that Mandalore was full of open territory. They could build factories here, and maybe even construct a shipyard over Concordia. One of her advisors, who was not in on the joke, challenged her. Satine quieted him with a venomous tone, before Bo brought some refreshments in for their guests. Dooku and the CIS leaders had a couple sips, and they got back to business. The conversation went on for a while, but the Jedi moved in patiently. Before they could actually strike, Dooku stood up and thanked Satine for her loyalty to the Separatist movement, before he slipped and slammed his head into the table. The Jedi burst out and ignited their weapons. Obi-Wan moved in front of Satine as the other Separatist leaders fell unconscious, or, as a clone would soon reveal, dead. What no one knew is Anakin and Bo met up before the Separatists got there, and they decided that it'd be funny to poison the CIS leaders, so they didn't. Because Bo was handing out refreshments, Satine never thought anything of it. Dooku was trying to grab his lightsaber, but he was unable to. The worst part is, Bo didn't have any desire to reveal where the cure was, so Dooku just suffocated. There were some Separatist leaders who didn't drink anything, like Wat Tambor, but he was captured, so no big deal there. At the same time, General Grievous blitzed a Republic medical station, when he was blindsided by 2 fleets. Jedi Masters Tin and Plo jumped short range to defend the station. It was empty anyways, but there was an astromech changing the readouts, so Grievous believed there were thousands of clones inside the station. This blindsiding ripped through his fleet, and the Jedi generals were able to lead bombers into the field of battle to cripple Grievous's flagship, which worked to perfection, eventually leading to his death. On Coruscant, the Jedi had an officially unscheduled stop with Palpatine. Yoda suggested that they do a public event with each other to gather support for the war. It could be a good way to see the Jedi and Chancellor side by side in the public. Yoda was very adamant that he would make sure everything was handled. Palpatine had Masa Meda go and make arrangements, but the Jedi, thanks to Anakin, knew who else to target. So when the day came, Palpatine just vanished without anyone knowing where he went. The security cameras were bugged, and the Jedi had one of the Senator allies host an event to cover up their tracks. It was a very intense and stressful process, but it went smoothly, as was the flights across the galaxy. It was a little funny. Once the Jedi stopped playing the game and started thinking for themselves and trusting the Force, they became semi-functional. There'd be some unrest following the disappearance of Palpatine, but the Republic rallied, a lot quicker than the Separatists did. The Republic was long established, so they could fall back on trustworthy faces. The CIS couldn't, because it was entirely built around Dooku and was less than 10 years old. They crumbled almost immediately, and this allowed Mina Bonteri to reunite with her friend Padme and begin the peacemaking process. It was long and arduous, but various worlds from around the neutral systems pitched in to make this process as seamless as possible. With victory following the months of treaties and discussions, the Jedi were able to return to their status in the galaxy. Here, Obi Wan and Anakin would open up dialogue again. While it had been kept secret for the last several months, Satine was pregnant, and she was going to have their first kid. Kenobi and she kept up the ruse, especially during the entire political session with Dooku. But by this point, it was time for Obi Wan to make a choice. He was 35. He lived the life he wanted to as a Jedi. Now, in his mind, it was time to live his life as a free person. Anakin was afraid though. He didn't want to be a Jedi without Obi-Wan. His master patted his shoulder and told him that he'd always be here, just like his friend Bo. They weren't going anywhere, and when Anakin felt like his time as a Jedi had run its course, he could return to Mandalore and be at home. Their talk was a bit somber, but it also was semi-rewarding. Anakin now had the thought of bringing Ahsoka to Mandalore, the same way Obi-Wan did with him. Kenobi would renounce his seat and abandon the Jedi Order so he could openly be with Satine, and be there for and with her when the time came for their first kid to be born. Turned out they themselves had twins, so they would name them Ben and Suna. It was a peaceful life on Mandalore. Despite Obi-Wan not being a Jedi, he would take up other forms of work inside the city. He'd become an instructor at the local university. It wasn't easy to become one, but he did it with joy. It was something that just made him happy, while also positively contributing to society. Their openly married life would continue for their lives. Anakin, after finishing Ahsoka's training, would do as Obi-Wan did, by abandoning the Order and joining Bo-Katan in her life, free from the binds of the Jedi Code. They wouldn't stay put on Mandalore like Duchess and Duke Consort. Their lives would be a lot more adventurous. But as two people in their younger 20s, adventure was a great desire. Plus, they had a place to call home, though it was still Princess of Mandalore, as it was. They could go back anytime they wanted. The galaxy around them would shift into a more peaceful era, especially without the curse of the Sith. But their individual lives could only be described as perfect. The Kenobi Kryze twins would grow up with the perfect family around them, and they would be shown how to become leaders when their time eventually came. Bo and Anakin's relationship would mirror Obi-Wan and Satine's, but the big difference is the two of them took a lot longer to get around the tying the knot. But there was no issue with that. Anakin's mom, Satine, Obi-Wan, and their little family were there to support them when the time came, and they're happily ever after on Mandalore. And that, my friends, is another wholesome PP story. Again, special thanks to all of our patrons: Benjamin Wells, Alexandria Reese, The Beginning and End, M, Django Fett Clone, Nick 5098, INTJ Recluse, Ben Ingram, The Big Red Pure Mark, Diamond Constant, Darth Nemesis, Lord Tibbs, CC2024, Galvin Gaming, Tristan Mandalore, Sir Realm 1767, Darth Revan, Granddaddy Ban, Laliand, Sky Guy, Penguin, Cullen Rooney, Shark Midori, RJ38, Nick, Michael Erlanger, The Last Jedi, Apollo, Weewu670, Annika Stank Runner, CT7567, Toaster Oven, Oz of Oz, Darth Knox, The Eternal Padawan, Joshua Tem, Johnny Naguin, Sansa Skeleton, Jedi Sloth, Mr. Yeet Gamer, Lord Cali, Galaxy66, Mammoth Studios, Anakin003, Lord Draken, Fortis Legacy Star Wars, Airbus, Rex the Wolf, The Man with the First Names, Baron Joshua, and Lord Deadwing. For supporting the channel, smash that like button, support my ways, check out other things. So this kind of completes the trifecta of Obi-Wan Satine stories. We have him saving her from Maul, well. We have from leaving the order for her, and then the secret marriage one. And I think this one might be my favorite. I really like the idea that Obi-Wan does what Anakin does in Attack of the Clones, and how they could really shift him as a person. I think him having an emotional connection as deep as Satine, and having it last after his Mandalore mission, would deeply change his connection with not just Qui-Gon but the Jedi Code, and I wanted that to be very present throughout this. It's his story of training Anakin being different, but his story overall not being that different. Like, he still loses Qui-Gon on Naboo, and he still has to go through the process of training Anakin, but his relationship with the Jedi Order is much different. And I also wanted it to be like this really cool scenario where he's a little bit more rogue than Qui-Gon, but he's a lot more articulate than Dooku and Qui-Gon, so the Council trusts him, and they see him as one of their own, which is kind of a nice way to twist how Obi-Wan views the Council and how they view him. Also, I wanted to bring back that fan favorite of Bo and Anakin's little relationship from that video about a year ago. So, I hope you all enjoyed. I love you all, spread the love, and always mind, my friends, may the Force be with you.